at the Happy Body, Happy Planet Summit. And one more time, I think I just lost your visual. Here we are again at the Happy Body, Happy Planet Summit. And today I have guests that to me are breathtaking and life-changing and so affirming everything that makes my esoteric and thinking about the world and humanity and everything on planet Earth. And I know they are humble and they are real searchers and explorers. They have written the most extraordinary book, What Really Makes You Ill? And we'll talk about the subtitle a little later. So that is the exploration. But in this exploration, it seems to me, is the realization that we today have a paradigm shift, have a thinking shift that is akin to the shifts in thinking that at the time of Plato and Socrates analyzed what society is. Not that it was easily implementable, we're still working at it, right? And at the time of Bruno and Galileo, again, allowed the entire world to perceive planet Earth as a different entity as was previously thought. No longer flat, no longer falling off into the Hades like the Greeks believed, but round and circulating around the sun. And now we're in the paradigm shift of realizing that our perception of what nature is actually not what nature is. And that, of course, plays into medicine and everything. So I am so incredibly excited to present to you the incredible researchers and book writers, authors, Don Lester and David Parker of What Really Makes You Ill. Don and David, how did you even get into this incredible topic?
Okay. Well, through life experiences, really. I mean, going back many years. I mean, as you've already said, the book took us 10 years to write. A lot of research went into it. But what led us up to it is we'd written a couple of little books before it, and one of which was about the nature of reality, which we can sort of bring into this because you were talking about perception. And the human perception of reality is something that has been changing through history. And there are certain milestones that humanity comes to when there's sort of almost a quantum change in their perception. And it was whilst we were writing that book that one of the chapters happened to be about viruses. And we realized we needed more information about viruses, although it wasn't a medical book. As I say, it was about the nature of reality. And once we started looking into it, we realized that everything we thought we knew about viruses and disease was wrong. So that's really what kicked the book off. We realized there was so much wrong. The more that we looked into what really made you ill, the more we realized everything we'd been told was wrong, which means everything the medical establishment was practicing was wrong. It was based on a fallacy, as we found, called the germ theory, still called a theory, but it's a theory that's never been proven. So that's really what kicked the book off. But I'm glad you mentioned about perception, because I have mentioned it before, and I think it's very relevant. When I sort of borrowed the words of Charles Dickens from the title of one of his books, Tale of Two Cities, when it opens up with, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. And I think that is very apt now because of this perception change, because we're in a stage, certainly of the worst of times, with what the governments of the world, aided and abetted by the medical establishment and the mainstream media, what they are doing to the world. You know, they've basically closed it down. They've caused untold misery, which is continuing, all based on a lie, the coronavirus lie, really. There's no virus has been substantiated to support this, and yet they've almost closed the world down. And as I say, it's affecting businesses, health, education, everything. So the worst of times, really. The world has never seen anything like that, certainly in any of our lifetimes. So that's the worst of times, but it's also the best of times because it is going to bring about a perception change. And a lot of people are not only going to question and are questioning the reality that they're experiencing, but they're starting to look more for reasons. And that's sort of where our other book, The Nature of Reality, comes in, because that changed our perceptions when we wrote that many years ago, because we soon realized that everyone's experience of what reality is again a false impression. And we found by researching that very deeply and talking and reading a lot of books by various philosophers, going right back, as you mentioned, Plato and Socrates, and up to modern day physicists. And we found that all physicists, when they look at it, the nature of reality, for long enough, all become philosophers, because they realize that materialism is a false impression. And because it's a very complex subject, I'll just give a little example of what I mean by that and what physicists have come to believe. That there was one physicist whose name I can't remember at the moment, but that doesn't matter, who said that within his studies of many years in physics and quantum physics, that to be able to say there's an out there is not supportable by science. There is no out there, which is quite an astounding thing to say. And there another physicist called Professor at the time, Professor Amit Goswami, who wrote a book called The Self-Aware Universe. I got it right? Yes. The Self-Aware Universe, which basically what the conclusion they come to is the whole of reality is a conscious experience. What appears to be solid and separate to us is the illusion. And the way I can best describe this and ask everyone to just think about it is, if you imagine what happens when you're in a dream, when you're dreaming, when you're asleep, whilst you're in the dream, that reality that you create, and it is you that creates it, seems perfectly real. It seems solid and external to you, and you interact with that reality as if it is solid and separate to you. You know, you can have cars and fields and people, you can have human interaction seemingly, and it only seems, or you call it unreal, when you wake up and say, oh, it's just a dream. But of course it was a different state of reality and was very real while you were in it. I mean, you can experience all sorts of emotions. So that's just a thumbnail sketch. So that
I love this. And I just want to interject that I so often put out the challenge when people talk about, that, well, it's the truth. It's the truth. Then I say, well, what if everything out there that we think we perceive is only a projection of our own consciousness? What if everything is just a projection? So, yes.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, and I know people will find it very hard to believe because it's quite mind-boggling, but it is provable. Strangely enough, it is provable that no one can actually disprove, that's the point, that what we experience on a daily basis is a state of consciousness. Yes. And we do, and I'm only going to talk about this briefly, otherwise we could spend quite a long time talking about just this aspect of reality. But if people just think about the analogy I've just given of a dream state and what they think is the waking state, and then ask themselves, what is this waking state made of? What is materialism actually made of? Science will tell us it's made of, broken down to atomic structures. And we say, yes, okay, well, what's an atom made of? Oh, well, it's got a nucleus and orbiting electrons. And okay, what is that made of? And they just keep going down and down until they come to a full stop and just go, well, it's energy. Well, okay, and what is that? And here we are, right at the first stage where they have to admit that they don't actually know. Hence, the physicist who said, science cannot prove that there is a solid out there. So we start to build that we have a state of consciousness that we operate in. And because it's a state of consciousness, and much of it is our personal state of consciousness, we can affect what that is. We can affect our experiences once we know how to pull the levers and press the buttons, as it were.
And we can affect our children's perception. And I want to switch to Dawn because she's been so quiet for a moment. So allow us to hear your thoughts and how, and also I was so curious on how the two of you collaborate, because it's, to me, that's a dream that has never come true, but I just want to hear how you do that from Dawn.
Oh, I was going to go back to sort of expanding on what David was talking about, what you were talking about before, to show how science has tried to answer all the questions, but obviously is limited to what it call to the materialistic aspects, and so they can only look at certain aspects of reality by using their physical machines, and so they don't have any way of looking at anything that, shall we say, is non-physical. They don't understand consciousness. They think it's an epiphenomenon of the brain, so they think it's all in the brain, and that simply isn't the case. It's beyond that. But science, the real point of science, or the real purpose of science, is that it's a way of inquiring and getting information about the world. It's investigating and continually looking and finding information, and when that information gives them the possibility of preparing sort of theories and ideas, and then what should happen is that when new data, new information turns up, or they look at something else, they should be able to change their theories if it conflicts with their original, if the data conflicts with their original theory. Unfortunately, we're finding, and certainly with which we'll get into later, I'm sure, with the germ theory, that they've stuck on a place where it's become dogma, and in fact science in many fields, many disciplines, is now scientism as opposed to real scientific inquiry. And what we've found is certainly the case when looking at the medical establishment and their ideas about what the body is and how to look after the body, because they only look at disease, and so they fix disease instead of looking at how to create health. So it is a complete paradigm shift in the way we want to look at the human body in the state of health, and it's much more natural, and it's not to do with scientism or the way that scientists or that science is going in the medical field, which is trying to fix things that are broken, but they're not broken. The human body has far more capabilities than it's given in sort of medical science. It's not just an inert machine that can be fixed by external means, but as well as the things that people can do to help their health, it is part of their perception. It is also connected to how they feel about things, and so when you're tied into a fear-based kind of system, then fears are detrimental to health, and so it does.
All religions that we know of that are the recent monotheistic religions, meaning one God, breathe this fear into you if you don't abide by his rules, right? And
yes. And so people don't think they have responsibility and don't think they're in control of their lives, whereas in fact they are completely in control of their lives. And it's a question of understanding the responsibility that they do have and the power that they do have, and that's where they're being crushed at the moment by this fear.
Because I like that you're saying responsibility, because freedom is actually co-responsibility. Is that what you're saying also?
Well, yes. It sort of brings us back to where I was a little earlier. What I was trying to say when I was saying about the best of times is because of the world situation that we have at the moment is so extreme that people are asking more questions, and it's requiring this perception shift. And because it is a conscious, all reality stems from consciousness, that people will start to realize, as Dawn has said, how much power they have when they make a conscious decision. They're not helpless beings as governments would have you believe, where you have to ask the government for this, that, and the other, and only if the government gives you permission to not do social distancing, or if the government gives you permission not to wear a mask, or whereas they can take responsibility themselves, and they have the power, they have the mental power, because like in a dream, the dream analogy that I gave, where you can sort of become awake in a dream, if you like. You're still in that dream state of consciousness, but you can start to control it. It's the same with this state of consciousness, which we call waking reality. And you can get more control. And so you can change the way the world is. You know, people are not powerless. They're extremely powerful.
Right. But I want to interject here that in my looking at history, somebody said recently to me, it's a supply and demand. Tyrants are a supply and demand phenomenon, because if the people are not ready to take responsibility themselves yet, then a tyrant can come and say, I'm the strong man, I will lead you, I will tell you what to do, I will defend you, I will, etc. So isn't it also a matter then of human consciousness as a whole, again, going through different phases and coming now into the state where we don't want to be slaves anymore, where we women don't want to be in the kitchen and obedient to our husbands anymore, and where,
Absolutely,
you know, it's an evolution that seems to be happening worldwide in all cultures, and here it is, but we can't handle it still.
Well, but it's because it's happened worldwide with this nonsense that has been inflicted on the world. It's bringing people of the world together. So rather than using your analogy of a tyrant in a particular country, you know, which may be thousands of miles away from where you live, seemingly, and so people don't particularly get involved in it. They may never have even heard of the country, some little principality somewhere in Central Africa or something, and they may think that doesn't affect them in any way. But this thing that's happened now has affected the whole world all at the same time. So it should bring, I'm hoping, bring people together mentally and physically, we'll use that in inverted commas, much more, so that they can act as a world population, as a world community, to change the reality that the world is experiencing by changing their conscious habits and their conscious beliefs. And these are very powerful things, and I can't stress how important that is, because that, as I say, that would take us quite a few more hours to talk about that. But so that's coming back to the words I used of earlier, which is why it's the best of times, because for the first time the world can see the tyrannical behaviour of what they think are their governments and see them for what they are. They are not acting in people's best interest. So the people need to take the power back to themselves, take it away from governments, take it away from the mainstream altogether, and take it back to where it really belongs, which is with them. So they need to get that conscious action together. And so that's in the larger political field, if you like, but it's also in what our book is about, which is about taking health back into their own power. Yes. You know, and you know.
May I go to the first question that I have on my list here? Sure. Is back to the planet, and then as it affects our body, of course. What in your minds has caused this sixth extinction? Is that possible to wrap it in a few sentences?
So, sorry, could you?
Sixth extinction.
Right, okay.
In the sixth extinction, as is acknowledged, you know, when you just look out and you see that the bees are dying and we have lost half of the insect populations and all the different species, we're losing hundreds of species every day. So
And a
what
lot
has
of that.
caused this, and how does it all connect?
Okay, well, with our research, and we do write about this in the book, with electromagnetic frequencies, and there's lots of case studies to show that the loss of insects, loss of bees, affecting not only wildlife and plant life and human life worldwide is definitely being affected by the increased levels of electromagnetic radiation, not only from cell towers, but from radar installations, electrical pylons, power stations, all of these things. Anything that generates electricity generates electromagnetic fields, and depending on your proximity to them, can be very detrimental. Again, a short thumbnail sketch: the human body is a complex electrical system as well as a chemical system, so it's an electrochemical system, and those electrical voltages in the human body are tiny, very, very tiny, and so can easily be disrupted by outside powerful electrical frequencies. You know, anyone can see an example.
Also talk about the chemical revolution and the impact.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. The chemical revolution. I mean, really, with the rise of industrialization. The petrochemical industry started probably it started a few centuries ago, but it's kind of built from I believe the early 20th century, mainly in America. And so they've used petrochemicals in just about everything, and including medicines. And again, that was one of the, I suppose, shocks for us when we found that substances that are supposed to heal are made of petrochemicals that are in fact known to be toxic. So this brings to the bigger picture of, again, why the book is so large. Is one particular chapter is extremely long, and it's given the fairly nasty title of Poisoned Planet. It's not because we wanted to scare people, but we wanted to make people aware of a wide array of toxic materials that are used in just about everything. And again, because it's the worst of times that there are so many poisons out there that affect just about every aspect of our lives, this is also the best of times that we can say, no, we've got to stop doing this. We've got to go back to being more natural, and so that we can look at how to be healthy, how to have our bodies to be healthy, and how to have the planet to be healthy, which is to stop poisoning it, in a nutshell. But of course, that requires knowledge of where the poisons are and where they're being used, and also the way they're being used inappropriately, which is one of the main themes in the book, is that they're used to combat germs, because everyone's frightened of germs. And so it's a battle against the germs in absolutely everything. So
we are germs.
Well, our bodies are full of bacteria, and we absolutely need them. If we kill the bacteria, we kill life on Earth. So it's time to stop trying to kill them. So we really need to realise that, and that's why it's such a complete paradigm shift from that model of trying to kill everything in order to make it healthy. And we often use the phrase, we say to people, but you can't poison the body back to health. And it's not just the human body, it's the planet as well. So we've got to realise germs aren't the enemy, it's the poisons used to kill them that's the enemy, if you like. And that needs to stop. And so it's a completely different way of looking at everything, which again is why the book is quite extensive, because we felt we had to cover just about all aspects, so people can see where the problems lie and what they can do about it.
Yeah, and that's why we're getting back to what I said in the beginning. This paradigm shift is massive, because we're at the same time that we're experiencing this worldwide pandemic, in quotation marks, the planet is actually getting a breather, but we're going to hammer it when we reopen with the same industries, what can everybody do to stop this, to change? Yes.
I think it's knowledge, and again, that's really what the book's about. I think as people become more knowledgeable about how they're really, I'll be blunt, how they're lied to by the mainstream in all its aspects, whether it's the medical establishment, the governments of the world, or the pharmaceutical companies, the banks. None of them, and them aided and abetted, I have to say, by the mainstream media, which is bought and paid for by these same industrial complexes. And then none of them are telling us the truth about life, about what makes us ill. None of them are telling us the truth. And no matter how much,
often the not so higher ups people in the world who are perpetuating these instructions and behaviors do themselves actually believe that they are telling the truth. And I think that is the difficult part. I have so many friends who actually full force, head in the sand, went for it.
I think without getting too much into the sort of politics of it, unless you want to, of course, is the world governments that we see, which are supposedly elected by the populace, are not the ones that are in control. I think probably many people are starting to realise this. There's a cabal, I'll call it that. I could use more uncharitable words, but there's a cabal that sits behind these governments. They're unelected, but they control all the banks, they control the world resources, and they're the ones that are pulling the strings. They have a goal in mind, which they would call a world government, which is going to be them, of course. So there'll be no individual sovereign governments in their ideal world. There'll be just one world government controlled by them, which controls all the people, all the resources, all the money. That's really what's behind it, which
Did
is...
we have this, and we can talk about that because people can perceive that as truth. Didn't we have this in the early 1900s with the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, who was else? Morgan Stanley family, and what's the other one?
Yeah.
Owned 50% of the world's wealth at the time, and now we have another, I think it's 8, who own 50% of the world's wealth.
Well, of course.
Is that comparable? So,
well, those.
But out of the early 1900s, how can we get out of it now?
We can. I mean, those families that you mentioned are still there. You know, they're still controlling things from behind the scenes with huge, unimaginable wealth. And the way we can get out of it, if you like, brings me back to my original point, is a consciousness shift to believe and expect that we can. And that brings around changes without you having to be prescriptive and go, oh, well, we need to do this and we need to do that and we need to elect this person and then that'll make the changes. It doesn't work that way. That's been tried and it doesn't work that way. As a collective, humanity needs to look at the situation they've got and reject it mentally themselves and really believe and expect they can have something better. The facts will come about. They only have to hold that belief and expectation that it can be changed. Yes, there may be little things that they can do, which in sort of rebellious ways, if you like, of refusing to wear a mask or refusing to do social distancing because it's a nonsense, and asking questions of anyone they can, politicians or whatever, to say, well, have you ever proved that this coronavirus exists? Where are the tests? Where are the papers to prove what you say? Because they don't exist, because Don and I have looked for them and we're not the only ones. You know, it's never been categorized, it's never been proved to exist. So it's all built on a lie.
Now, can I go deeper into that? Where did you look and where did you not find or people could not provide?
Well, with any
I'm getting that all the time, you know, yes, they're there, you just haven't looked.
Yeah, well, because they're supposed to be scientific peer-reviewed papers, they get published. Because if someone discovers something, a new virus, let's say, they're very eager to get their name on a scientific peer-reviewed paper to say, look how clever I am. I've discovered this thing. My name will go down in medical history and I'll get lots of better jobs and much more money, putting it bluntly. So, people really want to get their names on these papers, so they should be easy to find if you do research for it, but they're not there. And we've looked for these papers for every type of virus. And as I say, we're not the only ones. I mean, Carrie Mullis, the late Carrie Mullis, who invented the PCR test, which they're using incorrectly to this day, looked for some of those papers himself, particularly HIV/AIDS. He looked for the papers to see whether there was actually a virus that caused AIDS. And again, he said they're not there, And, this is a guy who knew what he was doing and got a Nobel Prize for his scientific endeavours. So, as I say, we're not the only ones, and these papers are not there, and they should be if they existed. So, and we put it in our book, and we've challenged people to say, well, the onus is on you, Mr. Scientific Community. If you're going to say a virus is the cause of this disease, then the onus is on you to prove it. And of course, they can't. I'm sure probably a lot of people listening today will be familiar with the case of Dr. Stefan Lanka, who a couple of years ago challenged the medical establishment to prove whether a virus caused measles. And after a couple of court cases in the High Court in Germany, they were unable to do that. They couldn't prove it. And that was just one virus. And he said publicly, and he was a virologist. He's still a doctor, of course, but he refuses to be called a virologist because he realizes it's a nonsense. But he said at the time, he and his team have never found any virus to be the cause of any disease. And that's an astounding statement to be made by a virologist. And that's what we found. There is no proof. These things called viruses are just cellular debris, basically. They're not infectious agents. But this lie is perpetrated on the public, for decades, for the last 100 years or so. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies have made huge profits out of this, of producing medicines and vaccines to kill something that doesn't actually do anything. So it's a fantastic business model.
Well, then of course I get. What about the smallpox? What about the plague? What about the Spanish flu? What was that, if not?
Okay. Well, again, all of those things are covered in our book where we explain it, because we looked into it, including the plague, the Black Death, as it's often called, and that's quite an interesting point because not many people look at that, but we did. And to cut a long story short, we looked back in history and looked at what evidence there was as to, because we were all taught that it was infected rat fleas going around biting people and infecting them with this terrible disease. And millions died all across the world, particularly through Europe. So we looked at that and again found there was no evidence to support it. And there was some very interesting evidence to come from a professor in an Irish university called Professor Mike Bailey, who was a dendrochronologist, someone who studies tree rings. And because a lot of trees live to very old ages, he could look back at the tree rings and tell what the atmosphere was like at any particular period in history. And so he looked at tree rings from around the world for that particular period in history when the Black Death was rampant, supposedly. And interestingly, he found that the atmosphere of the Earth had become extremely toxic, so much so it was poisonous. There's high levels of ammonia and all sorts of toxic, so much so that people were just dropping down dead in the street. So there was not an incubation period where someone becomes ill and over a period of a week or so becomes worse and dies. These were people being perfectly okay 1 minute and dropping down dead in the street the next, which is something strange. But one of the very strangest things, and this is from eyewitness accounts of people living at the time, said that the waters, the rivers and lakes, were being poisoned and the fish were all coming to the surface dead. Well, that can be nothing to do with rat fleas. So, and also Professor Bailey did a correlation between tree rings and ice core samples. And again, they correlated that the atmosphere had gone through this extremely poisonous stage, which is far more likely to have been causing these massive deaths across Europe in particular than anything to do with rat fleas. I mean, it's now been scientifically shown that there was no way a disease could spread that quickly, even if there were such things as poisonous parasites or something on a rat. It's an impossibility. And the fact that there's never been, because they were supposed to kill the rats as well, and sort of geologists, archaeologists have never found what should have been thousands of the remains of dead rats, across the world, and they've never been found. So there was never a sort of a mass dying off of rats, which of course they should have been if they were being killed as well as passing on the disease to humans. So I'm giving you again a very thumbnail sketch of it all, but we do cover it extensively in the book.
Yes.
But again, it's one of those things.
I'm so glad we're talking about this as well, because these are not suppositions that you're making. These are actual evidence-based suggestions of a new interpretation of the phenomena that occurred. And what poisoned, I mean, people didn't poison the world at the time. What poisoned the world?
At that time, well, what he found was that at that particular time, there was some strange events. There was quite a number of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions around, and also eyewitness accounts talk about a comet passing through the Earth's atmosphere. So there could have been debris from the comet. Certainly when you get earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, there's great outpourings of toxic materials and gases from those things. So it's far more likely that the extremely toxic, poisonous atmosphere was caused by a combination of those things that were all happening in concert at that particular time, because what else could have poisoned the atmosphere to such an extent over such a wide area to cause people to just drop down dead in the streets?
And it wasn't human-made chemicals at the time, but
no.
Is it now?
Well, now we have, yes, we do have human-made, man-made chemicals now. And again, that's covered extensively in our book, as Dawn said earlier, where these chemicals come from. And it's interesting to know, well, quite alarming to know, that these chemicals that are man-made chemicals are not properly tested, even though there are bodies like the FDA in America and organisations in NHS sort of places in the UK, which are supposed to monitor these things and certificate them for being safe. And the studies are largely done by the actual producers themselves, who are they're not going to say anything adverse about what they're producing. But more importantly, I think, or just as importantly, there is never any testing done at all as to how any of these chemical substances act synergistically. What happens when you mix this chemical with that chemical out in the world, as it were? And none of those tests are ever done. So, and this includes even in medicines that you can get either prescribed by your doctor or bought across the counter at your local pharmacist. So you can inadvertently, shall we say, buy a cough mixture to alleviate your tickling throat, and at the same time take some other medicine that either you've bought yourself, and no one's ever tested what happens if you mix these two things together. And some of the effects of this can be absolutely catastrophic, and there's many cases to support that because they're never properly tested.
But what also...
And then there's also... Sorry, Dawn, go ahead.
No, I was probably going to say the same thing, that it's not just a question of these two medicines, it's everything else that people use in the way of products, the kind of chemicals that are in products they use every day, for washing, cleaning, yes, personal care products, cosmetics, just ordinary household cleaning products. If you have a look at the chemicals that are in those, and they are not tested for they may be tested to a limited extent individually, but rarely are they ever tested with any more than or their interactions with more than one or two others. But people are exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, on a daily basis, and there are no tests. It's impossible to actually test because everyone's exposed to completely different combinations, and it's just not possible to test. Science actually, one of the scientists, can't remember which one, says that science has no way to analyze these multiple exposures. They just cannot tell what the harm or what's going to happen, what's the result of exposures to these. So what happens is that people are going on their everyday lives thinking that the products they're buying and using are absolutely safe. They have to be careful, not to breathe in the sprays of certain chemicals, if got to be careful. But it's not just in the home. I mean, it's in the workplace as well. And in many workplaces they use far more toxic materials, certainly for cleaning, that kind of thing. And it's quite
in the bathrooms.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I mean,
yes.
there's an interesting video that's either just been released or just been released called Dark Waters, and it really sort of, I won't say dramatizes it, but it shows the DuPont case. This is in relatively recent years, because DuPont, one of the things that they brought to the market was Teflon. People may remember, when your non-stick frying pans and all the rest of it, an extremely toxic material. And I recommend anyone to watch the film Dark Waters, because it's a very interesting case study for many reasons, not only showing the duplicity of governments and chemical companies as powerful as DuPont, but also the whole system. And if it wasn't for just one man, I won't go into the story too much, a lawyer who worked for Taft, a big law firm in America, his, almost inhuman, no, not inhuman, his amazing ability to stick with it, even though it was making him ill. I mean, it took him about 13 years to actually bring DuPont to court to properly give recompense for what they've done.
I've had I'm cutting it a little short. I've had the pleasure and incredible learning experience of translating hundreds, thousands of documents for an international law firm. And a lot of these were, of course, patents and research on new chemicals and new weapons and you name it. And I came to the bottom line concept, kind of, that we need to begin to understand that every molecule that we create under circumstances that do not exist in nature, and they're created under extreme circumstances with high pressure and high temperatures and super cold and shock and combinations that don't occur, etc., in nature. So when we create entities that do not exist in nature, they also cannot decompose in nature, and They will interrupt the entire life cycle. Is that valid?
Yes.
True. I think chlorine is one of those.
Yes, chlorine's definitely a good example of something like that. Chlorides do exist in nature, tightly bound in salts. But when a certain experiment released chlorine as a gas, they found it was extremely toxic. But chlorine, as in that gas form, is so highly reactive that it binds with organic matter, so carbon-based matter, and that's why it's really dangerous for humans, because it'll get into the body and it'll be pretty detrimental, because it takes the place of certain other atoms, and it's just the reactions and interactions in the body that it changes things. And as you say, the more the thousands and many thousands of chemicals that are being made all the time, they are unnatural, and the main problem is, exactly as you say, that they do not biodegrade naturally, and so they are persistent. They bioaccumulate in the body, or either in the human body or within the planet, and it just builds up more and more toxicity and just really disrupts normal life. And that's really going back to the question you asked about the sixth extinction, that this has to stop, and people have to realize that convenience isn't necessarily the way of life. We have to realise that convenience has allowed, or the desire for convenience products or convenience machines and those kinds of technologies, it might sound like a good idea, but unfortunately they're almost always detrimental to living organisms, which is the human body, as well as the planet, as well as all living organisms. So it's really a question of changing the way we look at how we live our lives and say no. And these are decisions we can make, that we can stop using those kinds of products and vote with your purse, as they say. So, support the people who are making the more natural products, and stop buying and using the unnatural products. And that is certainly one type of action that we can take, as well as expecting things to change. But there are certain actions we can take. Trying to fight these big people is not always a good idea. You can't, but what you can do is by taking your energy and putting it into a better place, which is the supporting people who are trying to make things more natural, supporting more natural foods, plant-based foods, healthy foods, organic foods, all that kind of area. And so there are lots of things that people can do to help make things better. But it does mean looking at everything you use in the home, everything you put in and on your body, everything you use for all kinds of products in the home, as you say. Also, people being aware of what's going on in the workplace, and also to stop using things that kill germs, because there are, that's a good start. That's a good starting point, because that's yes, definitely.
Can I spray you with hand sanitizer? Everybody says at every store you walk in New York.
Yeah, we have the same thing here, and we always hold a hand up and say, absolutely not.
No,
just
thanks.
Keep it to yourself, and they do. So yeah, and it's these little things that people need to do. They need to take some action. And there's nothing violent about that.
No.
It's just refusing to toe the line with things that we know are detrimental to life and the planet. And these are little decisions, as Dawn said earlier. Take your money away from these places. Don't support them. It's no good appealing to governments, because they're not going to do anything. But you can take your pound and spend it somewhere else, or your dollar and spend it somewhere else. So
yes, and I wanted to use this opportunity to ask, have you ever changed your diet in your lifetime, and how?
Oh yeah. I mean,
many times.
Yeah, Dawn and I are both vegetarians, well, vegans really, and but we weren't always. I mean, I've been sort of vegetarian now for over 40 years, so
about 20 years. So yes, I took longer to get to it, but I made changes fairly quickly when I got to it.
And this is just sensible. I mean, it's our research has shown us that a plant-based diet is the most healthiest, organic as much as possible, and vegan is, from a vegan point of view, it's as much ethical as healthy, because of the, as I'm sure anyone who's looked into it, because of the factory farming methods. When you look into it, whether it's with chickens or even just milk, of what farmers do to have their cows keep producing milk, taking their calves away from them. It's just disgusting. And so there's no ethical way to really support that type of endeavor. So if for no other...
Is there hope that we're coming out of this violent phase of patriarchy, which I call the last 7,000 years, from the empirical structures forming into today's? Is there hope that we're coming out of violence against each other, violence against the planet, and violence against our own body? Because that's really what you're describing, aren't you? These chemicals we ingest and are really violently interfering with our body.
I think there is. I definitely think there is. I mean, I'm ever the optimist. I believe in conscious creation, but also, people have got to stop watching the news, because it's determined to show the world in the worst possible light. A lot of things are manufactured that you see, and I'm talking about the so-called news. It's really propaganda, and they'll show you violence here, there, and everywhere. And they've been caught out many times that it's something made up, or they've shown something that completely out of context. But they'd have you believe that there's no hope, that there's lots of race hatred, that everyone's killing one another somewhere. There's lots of religious unrest. They'd have you believe this. But when you get out in the world and talk to people, as we do, and in the different countries, it's more about harmony. You know, there's not all this religious antagonism. There's not lots of race hatred. You know, there might be little pockets of it, but it might be more to do with very small groups of government forces than it is with the general populace.
Yeah, I have to interject there, David. I have an African American family. I am an African American family. So when you live in the US and every single day there is something, you know, just recently somebody wanted to test hireability of people with exactly the same. So they made up resumes, you know, today everything is online. And half of them had African American names and half of them had white names, and they had the exact same qualifications. The African Americans were hired 50% less. So that's just, or were asked to come for an interview, you know, yeah. Of course, it was just a test. So it is still there today. This perception has been created, and to me, it comes along with the hierarchical structures that allow the rulers to use whatever possible to submerge, subject, oppress certain people. And the color scheme has been in place ever since probably India with the caste system, and then has been picked up by the colonialists to oppress the peoples in the colonies that they wanted to. And so you go a little bit into that as well. So I just wanted to say that there's still a lot of that in our whole value system and belief system. So yes, but
this is, if I could just come in on that, because it's a very important point. And I think the point of that is, it's like the example you just gave, it's the people that run those corporations that have these racist and can set up a racist type of institution. I find, and this may be something to do with the reality, and I'll come back to the beginning, with the reality I create that I live in. I don't experience that. I know if I watch the news, as I've just said earlier, I'll see all sorts of examples of racist activity, you know, despicable things. But in my own personal experience, I don't see that. I mean, many years ago, I lived in Africa. I lived in West Africa. So I have many African friends. Yes, I lived in Nigeria.
I lived in Zimbabwe for 4 years.
Well, I have friends from Zimbabwe and Zambia, and who I'm in touch with now. And there's never, ever been any problems with sort of racial tensions or anything like that, either when I lived in Africa or with the friends I made in Africa, African friends, and African friends that I have now in the UK. So within my life, racism doesn't play a part. So that's my personal experience. And this is the point I'm trying to get across to people, is to expect that in their lives, create that reality. So you might see it on the television, but that doesn't mean it's real, and it doesn't mean it has to be in your life. And the more people can push it out to the periphery of their experience, the better. Yes, there will be probably people you come across, like the examples you gave, of people recruiting in a company, and they're going to choose whites over blacks, you know, and they're expressing a racism. I mean, that brings us into another subject, really, of course, which is what are races? There are no different races. You know, we may have mentioned this before. There's only one race. There is no biological difference between people. You know, even if their skin color is different, they're biologically exactly the same. There are not different races. So the people who sort of perpetrate that myth are just ignorant, and all as they're expressing are prejudices. It's nothing to do with one race or another. So, but we have to do what we can to make that change, and we have to expect it to change. I mean, things have come a long way. I mean, I know in America, and you know yourself, racism in America has been terrible. America has a terrible record of racism, but things have got better. There's been a lot of suffering to get to that stage, and there's a long way to go, but it has got better. And so we have to keep.
We need to acknowledge that.
Yes, and we have to keep pushing to make it better, and pointing out, you know, the people who sort of act in a sort of a prejudicial way, if I can get that word out, is to not tolerate it, you know, and to point it out, you know, point the finger, and it will recede. It will disappear from our lives. It doesn't have to be there. I know that sounds like a utopia, but I believe we can have it.
I don't think it does to me, because again, we're in this paradigm shift, and that is part of the shift. I see it in my kids and their friends, and you know, it's all over the place. So I want to get to a little bit more of a harsh question. I was just talking to Gary Null and to David Martin, and was looking back at Vandana Shiva, who hopefully will also be on this summit. And they're all seeing that a lot of things will collapse. And my question is, who will survive as a culture, as a people, etc.? I mean, we've already kind of put that out there, but I just wanted to ask this question.
Okay.
When you looked at all of this, and your book is certainly full of the markers of something bad is going to go down if we don't change, and we're not changing fast enough, what is your perception of that?
Well, I think, I mean, Don and I talked about this a lot over the years, and we realized that the system that the world has, with the governments and the banking system, all the rest of it, is, in brief, is rotten to the core, as we've said. It is rotten to the core. The establishment is rotten to the core in all its aspects. And when something is really, truly rotten to the core, there's nothing you can do about that. You can't fix it, is what I'm saying. You can't make it better. It's like if you take an apple. If it truly is rotten to the core, there's nothing you can do to make that apple not rotten. You've got to chuck it away and get another one. And that's the situation we're in now, and people can see it. So not to tinker with it and think, oh, well, if we just got a new senator in, it'd be better. Maybe if we got a new president in, it'd be better. It never does. So the present system is rotten to the core, and we will see, I believe, because I believe they have overstepped the mark this time. More and more people are seeing the ridiculous nature of what they've done with this coronavirus thing. They will never trust them again. So they will implode upon themselves, if you like, the whole establishment in all its facets, whether it's government, medical system, mass media, military. It will implode on itself. It will become unserviceable. And out of that, it doesn't mean to say everyone's going to go back to the Stone Age or anything like that. There's lots of people who have been working for a long time with support groups of how things will change, and something will arise. We may not be able to put our finger on it today and say, oh, these will be the people that are going to save humanity. This will be the new age. This will be the new dawn. It will be a spontaneous thing, and it will happen because human nature and humanity is eternal, and great things. It has amazing potential. Most people don't realize just how great a potential they have. And so it will arise out of it. It will be a spontaneous thing, and it will arise out of the ashes, if you like, of this old system, which we presently have, which is corrupt and despicable and is collapsing and will collapse. But there'll be a new beginning come out of it. And that doesn't mean to say as I say, we have to go through some sort of Stone Age type thing before, it won't be like that. So I'm full of optimism, and I can see for the first time that this present system, will disappear.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought, kind of, that I tend to think that we can create so much out of the biodegradable versions, out of the, I call it earth compatible materials, earth compatible technology, because yeah, it has to be earth compatible with the laws of planet Earth. I always say, I don't know what works on Mars, but here this stuff doesn't work because it doesn't biodegrade, etc. But to shift completely into a topic that I also wanted to address, that is a very icky topic and that our children all still believe in and all still are scared of. And now some state governments have actually suggested that lovemaking is no longer a thing that you just do, even to your married partner, but you put on a mask and you don't kiss and you put on a condom and you make sure that you disinfect before and after. What is that all about? What are STDs and what is this craziness about?
Yeah, we can talk about that. I'm looking forward to the government explaining to people how they can still make love but keep their 2 meter distance. I'm interested to see what they're going to suggest for that. But anyway, no, all joking apart. Yeah, sexually transmitted diseases are something that comes up quite a lot. People ask us about it. Well, first let me say there is no such thing. And we can explain, well, we do explain it in the book. Things can happen. People can get blisters and rashes and things like that, which they then attribute to having had sex with someone. But
passing a germ. Almost always passing a germ.
Also had those blisters or has them concurrently, or those.
Well, what those things are, as in all cases, whether it's smallpox, labeled smallpox, chickenpox, measles, anything where there is a skin rash or blisters appearing, is pure and simple the body expelling toxins. That's its natural reaction. When it's not been able to get rid of the toxins through the normal processes of elimination, which is, through urination, excrement, through sweat, through breathing, the normal elimination processes, or even through the mucous membranes, which, where you may end up with a catarrh, or even coughs. And so those, but if you can't get rid of them, or it's more urgent, shall we say, whatever the toxic level is, it will come out through its major organ, which is the skin. That's the body's major.
That the encounter with a new person, the sexual encounter with a new person, can cause in the body a reaction of rejection of that new interaction with sperm and vaginal fluid. So that out of that can be a reaction of wanting to expel the toxins?
No, it's nothing to do with anything that's passed between the people. There is no, as we've said, no one has ever proved that there are any germs. Whether it's labeled syphilis or anything else, there is, or HIV/AIDS. All of these things that are labeled as sexually transmitted. There is no proof for these things.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I said gonorrhea as well.
Yeah, none of these things. So I'm not saying that people don't have these symptoms, but what I'm saying is the cause is something else. And now there are some things in a sexual encounter, shall we say, where even condoms are used or spermicides are used. Now these are chemical things. Condoms are latex, which is an irritant, and the lubricants and spermicides that can be used are irritants, and those in themselves can cause irritation, skin irritations and eruptions. Okay, but nothing to do with a germ being transferred between one partner and another. So that's one thing. But the other is quite often where and I'm thinking really of herpes now, where people get blisters, sores and blisters come up quite often in the genital area, sometimes on the face, around the mouth. And they get attributed to having a germ being passed between them and a sexual partner. Again, there is no proof for this. There is no proof that there is a virus called herpes that exists, that infects people. No proof whatsoever. So, sorry?
Wow.
And, and people can check this out.
Is the mind part of it?
I was just going to say yes. It could play a part, and there's the well-known kind of placebo effect where people take sugar pills and suddenly whatever illness condition that they thought they had can go. It can work the other way, that people can be certainly with what's going on now, the whole fear thing can make people ill. So there are people who may have had a certain upbringing that gave them ideas about certainly with religions, yes, but gave them certain ideas about sexual encounters, and may not be completely sure of what that's all about, and there may be hints of still feeling that it's some kind of sinful act or something. It just depends on the ideas that they have about it, and that could then generate some kind of reaction if there's a sense of, I don't know, guilt or something like that, or these kinds of emotional interactions. So the mind can actually produce physical eruptions, like manifestations, yes, eruptions, yes. But the other thing also, and to take it away from that particular field, that even something as simple as a cold, when somebody's sneezing, coughing all around them, and some people who really believe that it's infectious say, oh, I bet I'll get your cold. The next day they're coughing, sneezing. They think they've got their cold. They're manifesting those symptoms. So it's the mind can certainly be an element, and it could be greater or lesser for certain people. But again, I'm not saying it's for everybody. But again, it's always different for different people, and that's the whole medical system, that it's X equals Y. If you do X, then Y happens. This causes that. It's always a straightforward, very simple, or this disease exists. It's a particular entity, and it's caused by this. And that just simply isn't the case.
I'd just like people to consider as well that with the sexually transmitted thing, the idea of it is there are plenty of medical cases which show both men and women and children who show the symptoms of herpes. They have the blisters, they have the rashes, they have the sores. To all intents, they are expressing this so-called disease, herpes, and yet these people have never had sex in their life. This is men and women and children, of course, who have not had sex, and yet they've got these blisters, these so-called herpes blisters. Now, people need to take that into consideration. So there's been no sexual encounters in any of these cases, and yet apparently they have herpes. So it just gives a lie.
Those were just mistakes made in the testing, weren't they? Okay, I want to add a very revelatory personal story here to that very experience, that I was supposed to have received the herpes virus from my husband, and but then a few years later I tested negative for it. So I thought, oh, you see, I changed my lifestyle, I'm eating more vegetables, and now I've got rid of it. But then stress reoccurring, the monthly almost little blister reappeared. And so I thought, okay, well, they must have done the wrong test on me there. They must have made a mistake in that test. So, and I then decided to just not go to any doctors anymore and just deal with what I am experiencing myself. And of course, as a health investigator, I am finding means to figure out that, oh, it was just because I never slept enough. In my entire adult life, I thought I could get away with 4 hours of sleep because I love researching like you, right? I love learning. I love exploring and writing and doing, etc. So if I don't sleep enough, I get these little outbreaks. So
Yeah.
it's very, very simple.
Yeah.
And I can curb them, of course, also with certain natural remedies that are tinctures, essential oils. Basically, cayenne and ginger will do it. But yes, and the moment, I had your book in my hands and looked for herpes. What does it say about herpes?
No, it talks about STDs, yes. But it's the same thing. I mean,
and I had decided, I could just decide, oh, I don't have a disease. It'll never come back. What a relief.
well,
But it's
the
also
thing is,
about labels as well. It's a question of you, like you said, you go to the doctor and you get diagnosed and you get a label, and then you think it is this something that is an entity, a disease entity, and you've got a label, and so people think that they've got herpes instead of looking at the symptoms they've got and looking at what's going on in their life, and like you say, thinking, well, am I doing everything to look after myself? Am I under any stresses? Because that can certainly help produce physical symptoms. So again, maybe not sleeping enough, and sometimes we need to sleep more, sometimes we need to sleep a bit less. So it's fine, but it varies. You have to look at your life. But again, it's looking at these. Stop looking at these labels and stop thinking of these conditions as being actual diseases as such.
if we're to look at what the medical establishment says about herpes as a virus, I mean, this thing that they've put a label on and identified, they say, as the herpes virus, actually exists in everyone. If they're going to say, well, that's it, that's what it looks like, well, everyone's got it. So, but everyone's not constantly got blisters in the genital areas or on their face or anything else. And absolutely, I mean, we've researched into this a lot because we get asked it a lot. And there's nothing to do with the disease. It absolutely is not. And it is the body going through a natural process of expelling toxic material that has built up, that it's not been able to get out quick enough in the normal way. So it's a natural process. And it sometimes comes out through the skin, and it sometimes comes out in those particular tender areas. But that's not because there's anything wrong with those areas. It just happens to be that's where it comes out, because the body is very poorly understood, shall we say, as regards what it does and how it does it. And just because rashes and things might appear on a certain part of the body, it doesn't mean that there is something wrong with that part of the body. It just happens to be where the toxins are coming out. And let the body do it, and it'll be fine, and it'll go back to a normal, healed, healthy situation. There's nothing, you don't have any disease, no one does.
That's if we allow the body to do its thing of healing itself, right? If we don't add on to the dilemma by adding chemical cures or fixes, like you said.
Correct. Only, as we say in the book, only the body can heal itself, and you can either help it or hinder it. And most people tend to hinder it by giving it all sorts of lotions and potions, which gets in the way of the body healing itself. Quite often, very simple things when someone's ill is to just fast and rest. And that's an amazing thing. The body can just get on with things then. It's not got to be spending its energy going to work and work in a machine or whatever it is you do. If you rest and fast, so it's not got to worry about its intake of food, and it can just get on with the healing process, and you can get better much quicker if you get into that situation.
People think we need to go back to nature because people were happier 500 years ago or something like that. But people's life expectancy, at least in the written world that we know of, was much less. People supposedly died of lots of diseases all over the world, and because there were no fixes. What do you say to these arguments?
Sure.
Well, the thing is that
life expectancy is short.
Well, The people who say that, 500 years ago people had lower life expectancies are only talking about certain parts of the world, because certain parts of the world weren't known, and therefore they can only rely on the written records. And the written records are very, very sparse, and therefore they're not getting a view of what you might call the entire world. They're just getting a very small view. And 500 years ago, certainly in Europe, the way people were living, the living conditions were not particularly clean. They were fairly unsanitary. Well, yes, quite insanitary. They didn't get rid of their waste. They were living. Their diets were poor, probably, and in certain parts again. And sorry,
I said they didn't even bathe. Which they do in most of the cultures that we don't talk about.
Yes, and that's one of the things, again, importantly, it's not a question of you wash because you want to get rid of the germs, but it's a question of washing just for getting rid of whatever your body is exuding. So if you're eliminating toxins, they get washed off, but you don't want to then use chemicals to wash your body, because then that's just working against the natural thing. So it's a lot of people use that, we can't get back to nature because that's just going to live in caves and be very basic, and we don't want to do that. But that's twisting things, and that's certainly giving a particular perspective, because they want people to perceive that in fact technology and that kind of thing are in fact beneficial for us, and so they don't want us to say, oh, we don't want your technology, thank you very much, even though obviously technology is very useful. We're using it to communicate with each other and pass information around.
Here.
So, exactly. And so it is useful, and we should use it for what it can be used for beneficially. It's when it's used in a non-beneficial way that, of course, it's harmful. But again, these stories are sometimes put out to stop people from actually realizing that there were in various parts of the world, very different ways of living, and people were living healthily and cleanly. Not everyone was everywhere, but it's not quite as bad as we're told.
I think South America is a prime example. If you look at the true history of what happened pre to the conquistadors, and then what happened once the conquistadors had moved in, there was a high civilization there, which is, you can find the writings about it, and the indigenous people of South America were clean and healthy and had a good civilization. And this is some of the things that are starting to be realized now. They weren't primitive people living in the jungle with no idea about hygiene or farming or anything else. That's a complete myth. And it's also a myth that when the conquistadors went over there, that the indigenous population sort of died of smallpox because the conquistadors took it with them, and the local inhabitants had no immunity, and that's what killed them off. That's a complete fallacy. And I recommended it to someone only the other day that there's an American historian, Dr. David Stannard, who wrote a book called The American Holocaust, and I'd recommend people to read that. Now, we don't agree with what he says necessarily about smallpox, because he still believes in germs, but he gives you a much more accurate view of what happened with the way the conquistadors basically massacred huge amounts of people, drove them off their land, and hundreds of thousands of them died, mainly through starvation because they couldn't feed themselves.
Also just chopped up, literally. I came across a book that was written by a priest on one of the early ships, who describes that hacking people's hands and feet off when they couldn't bring gold was like standard practice, and before they knew it, the population was gone.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't even feed the people that they were enslaved to do the mining for the gold and silver, because they thought, well, there's plenty more people we can enslave, so when they died, they could be cast aside and just get some new ones. I mean, they had so little concern for the indigenous people, and that's a more true and horrifying picture of what really went off in just South America. And something similar, of course, happened in North America when the British, I have to say, invaded there. But so nothing to do with germs. And we do talk about all these things in our book to show that there are no instances that we could find either in humans or animals. We do talk about animal diseases as well, either in the distant past or the present. There are no instances where there are provable cases that germs made anyone ill. And that's why...
Let's say that again. You know, in an interview with Gary Null, he described to me that he was the first in the 1970s to discover that all plants have the full amino acid chain to form proteins, and nobody wanted to hear it. And he couldn't publish this scientific paper, for 12 years. So I feel this is exactly the same moment now for the germ theory. You are the ones laying it out there with all this evidence from all over the world, that there is no such thing as a pathogenic germ.
Correct.
They make these little entities that we see in the electronic microscopes, but they are not pathogenic germs transferring a disease from one entity to another, from one human to another human or animal. So this is such a moment. And I stopped Gary at the time when he was in this interview, and I said, this is such a pivotal moment. We need to emphasize this. So in this moment, we are saying here that there is indeed no pathogenic germ.
Correct.
In nature.
That's correct. And the whole disease thing, as we say in short, there are not lots of different diseases. There are just lots of different symptoms. And the symptoms of all diseases, whether the medical establishment want to attribute them to germs, which the book shows is a complete fallacy, or when they can't blame it on a germ, then they call it an autoimmune disease and try to blame the body of attacking itself, which is a complete nonsense and also completely unprovable. So again, we talk about all that in the book. And so all illnesses stem from, as we say, 4 factors, which we've written down, which is lack of nutrition, lack of proper nutrition, toxic overload, EMFs, and concentrated high levels of stress. And those 4 factors, or a mix of those 4 factors, are where human illness comes from, if you like. And those are all controllable pretty much by the way we choose to live. And so therefore, if we eat correctly and don't take in the toxins and try and avoid EMFs where you can, which is getting more and more difficult, of course, and to not be stressed. There is always a certain amount of stress in life, but it's when it's prolonged excessive stress that releases more free radicals in the body, which can be detrimental. But we explain all that in the book so that it is, you can lead a healthy life.
We will call it many more times, What Really Makes You Ill is the book, the incredible book. And my last question to you is, have you in your travels around the world seen examples of how it can be done differently in a futuristic sense, not in a sense of let's go back into the woods, because that I believe does not work?
Well, I think wherever you've got communities, and it's tended to be in communities where they can sort of control their environment better, they control what they eat, they grow their own food. I mean, those are the most examples, whether it's in Southeast Asia or even places in Europe where people have had to do it that way, try and get off the grid a bit. And I'm not, as Dawn says, we're not suggesting people go back to living in caves, but they just need to find ways of getting control of what is happening to them. And it's sort of like a holding stage, if you like, whilst what's going on in the world today sort of settles down and these people that have caused this problem get shuffled to one side. But it can happen, and it is happening. Yes, there are certainly in India, when I was there a few years ago. I mean, there are farming communities there which are pretty self-sufficient. I mean, there's some dreadful things happening in India, but always where the farmers have been lied to, shall we say, by well, I will name them, by companies like Monsanto, who've sold them chemical fertilizers to make their farming better, and it's done just the reverse, or they've been persuaded to use GMO stuff and it's not produced high yields. That's a complete myth, and many of the farmers have become bankrupt, and there's been a very high suicide rate in small farmers.
300,000 suicides now.
Yes.
Yes, Vandana Shiva's been writing quite a lot. So yes, you were mentioning her, and we have read a number of her articles, followed her work, talking about what's the situation in India and what happened when they tried to introduce the green revolution there, which was there was nothing green about that at all. It was pure chemical revolution and led to all kinds of problems. But also there are examples. One of the things that they use, or the system they use, is called agroecology, and that is about growing food naturally, going back to some of the older mixed cropping rather than monocropping, and using more natural, using all kinds of natural predators for the pests where they can, but not just going back to the old way, as it were, but also trying to develop new ways, being able to develop new plants that would be naturally resistant. So not GM, not through genetic engineering at all, but through natural hybridization processes, natural process to help with, to be more drought resistant in certain areas, because certainly in India that, there can either be monsoons or droughts, and so they have to be able to resist excess water or excess heat, and so that they are developing these new types of seeds, and so that's the kind of way forward, to use natural processes to breed new kinds of seeds rather than genetically modify them, because that just is not natural, and there is no way that they know what is going to happen. Those systems are completely unpredictable, and they're shown to be really quite detrimental to health, and they certainly don't improve the yield, that's for sure. The tests that initially, they had some results where there might have been a slight increase initially, but once the system was sort of going, once it was in use for a while, the whole yields, they were dropping off, and the organic crops were showing far better yields, and in all cases. So they really, that's growing clean food, if you like, is one of the main areas for people to concentrate on.
And I think there's been a growing interest in organic farming and organic food.
Yes.
And so that's very encouraging that people are, even if it costs a little bit more and more people are willing to spend that little bit more, because they realize the importance of it, and they realize it's a false economy to buy mass-produced stuff which is just going to poison them or make them ill in some way.
Yes. And I wanted to add here also, once we realize that 80% of the crops grown actually go into the factory farming, so we need so much less actual organic plant production for our food than we think we need now. So there's plenty for everybody if we just switch to organic, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of food scarcity is a complete myth, and that's been shown by many people. It's not food it's not food or the availability of food, it's the distribution of food, because when you look at how much food is wasted, it's heartbreaking. It's similar to the amount of food that is eaten in the entire continent of Africa. So that's the amount that's wasted, and so there certainly is no shortage of food. It's just a question of who's in charge, who's controlling the distribution, and
may I come in there?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
You said your next book may be about money and banking. And back in, I think it was in the 80s or early 90s, no, 80s, three Austrian filmmakers made a couple of movies. First about food waste. I forgot the title. Feed the World. We Feed the World, I think it was called. The second one was about or maybe it was the third one, Let's Make Money documentary. And it documents exactly what you're saying, how money drives food production around the world. And it's the bottom line in somebody's shareholders sheet. And it doesn't matter how many people die, starve, or whatever. It's that money rules.
Yeah,
Even our food
but
production.
but it's even worse than that. Yes, the people that control these resources and move the money around do it, as you say, to make money. But there's also a political angle to it. You know, they cause famines. I know this may sound hard to say, but it's deliberately. I mean, I know, as we talked about Africa earlier, I mean, Africa is a tremendous place. It's got all the resources that any country, I know it's a continent, but it has everything there. And yet it's one of the poorest places on earth. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? And if you look into it, you can soon see that how it's exploited by just about every other country in the world, the so-called developed countries, who are exploiting it. They're robbing Africa of its natural resources. They're holding it back from its development. And this is deliberate. This is not accidental. This is deliberate. And this happens all over. I mean, there's again an interesting book. I think Professor Michael Chozodowski called The Globalization of Poverty. And I think it should be a compulsory reading in all schools because it shows how literally the globalization of poverty is being used by these people as a global weapon to hold countries back from development so that they don't become a threat, shall we say, to these globalist powers that intend to control the whole world. So it's a very interesting book indeed.
Yeah. Let us begin to wrap up. I want to again tell my viewers and future viewers, and I hope this interview will go all over the world. I know it will go all over the world, but to as many people as humanly possible, because this information is so, so crucial. And I want you to also sign up for the gift that Don and David are providing, and that is a couple of chapters. They will tell us which ones of this incredible book, What Really Makes You Ill. And when you sign into their feed, you will get those chapters delivered to you, and you will buy the book anyway, but do that to get right now a peek into the incredible amount of evidence that they accumulate. Is it like 40 pages worth of references that you have?
Yes.
It's insane. And these references are not just from Yale and Harvard, because those are the two respected, and Oxford, respected institutions. They're from all over the world because, of course, thinkers and explorers of knowledge of science exist all over the globe. And I was so thrilled to see references from Asia, from the Middle East, from all sorts of countries also cited in this incredible book, What Really Makes You Ill. Don Lester and David Parker, you're my new heroes. I love it. I can't wait to get to London and get together and do a conference together on all this. The great paradigm shift is here. And to participate, you have now the opportunity to say, I will start, like you just heard, in my little house, in my little apartment, in my wallet, where I spend dollars, not on this, but on that, not on the chemical, but on the natural, in all that you do, and especially on what you put into your body. So What Really Makes You Ill has been my ray of hope that yes, there are enough of us to understand, because all the references, of course, are also often to people who have realized that what is perceived right now by the established, what do you call it, medical establishment, you call it, right, is not all there is, to put it mildly, or is maybe not at all what there is. So thank you so, so, so much. If you want to each say a final word to our listeners for many years to come, I know this interview will have a long, long life. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I mean, obviously, it's great for us to be able to chat to you. Yes, I would obviously encourage people to have a look at our website. We've got a new website up there, whatreallymakesyouill.com, naturally. So we put articles up there which people can read. They can watch various video interviews that we've done, so they can learn more about our book. Obviously, we hope people will buy our book. It's been very well received worldwide. Lots of information in there, as well as references. So, as you say, 40 pages of references, so people can do a little bit of research themselves if they want to. I'm sure there'll be lots in there that will help people and will help to bring about this world change, to take power back. People have to realize just how powerful they really are, and we hope our book will help in some way.
Yes. Well, again, thank you ever so much for those lovely words. You know, we really appreciate it. I don't think we realised in the 10 years that we were working on the research just quite what it would turn out, and we're pleased with how it's turned out, and we're absolutely amazed at the response that we're getting from it. And, you know, we're just thrilled to be able to put the information out, because the point for us is to give people the information that they need so that they can make truly informed decisions. They think they're making informed decisions based on what they're told through the mainstream media and various medical establishment outlets. Unfortunately, they're not given, as you say, they're not given the full information. So we wanted to put the information for people to be able to really just, you know, choose for themselves. So yeah, yes, and certainly one of the chapters we've prepared is the germ theory chapter, because that's quite a powerful one, we think. So that's
so people will be able to get access to that, certainly, and we may put some more little treats in there as well. So we'll see. But yes, so take your power back, people. That's what we're saying. Take your power back and start with your health. Okay.
I love you guys. This is amazing. Thank you so much for being on Happy Body, Happy Planet, and helping us take the next steps into the right direction. And people, don't forget to get the gift and connect with everything else that Don and David have to offer. It's amazing. It's a whole universe of new eye-openers wherever you go. Beautiful. Thank you so much. And again, we'll meet soon in person. I know that.
All right. So.
I have to figure out how to stop the video and see you in the real world soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Bye for now. I think it's